and welcome to part 2 of the Convo tutorial. Part 2 of the tutorial will build upon the concepts that we covered in part 1. In this part, we will show you how to make Convo tell you the weather for a city of your choosing. To begin, we start off like we did in part 1 on the Create Intents page. In addition to our existing intents, hello and goodbye, we're going to create a new intent and we'll name it Say the Weather. The key difference between this intent versus the other intents is that we also need a piece of information from the user, and that is the city that the user will be asking about. For example intent phrases, we might say something like, tell me the weather in Boston, or what's the weather in Boston? Of course, people might also ask about different cities, so let's go ahead and add in a few more intent phrases. So, what's the weather in Los Angeles? What's the weather in New York? And finally, let's just add in one last example of tell me the weather. So in this case, we aren't specifying a city, and we'll go into more detail later on what this might mean for Convo. Basically, whenever Convo detects that the user says something similar to these intent phrases, we want to trigger the intent, say the weather. Now, in order to tell Convo to learn about the fact that we want to extract the cities from the phrases that we say, we're going to use something called entities. So I'm going to go ahead and open the entities tab of this card and type in city. Note that just because you name the entity name city, Convo doesn't automatically know to look for city names like a normal human would. And so that's why we have to specifically tell Convo what a city is. So to do that, we're gonna click Highlight Entities. Basically, when you're highlighting entities, you're going to just use your cursor and highlight the specific words in your intent phrases that are classified as a city. So for example, I'm going to highlight Boston, Los Angeles, and New York. Note that entities are optional, so I didn't highlight anything in the last intent phrase, which is tell me the weather, and that's okay. Please try to be careful when highlighting because currently there's no way to undo a highlight other than manually editing the text box, which I'll show you in just a bit. Once you're done highlighting all the entities in an intent phrase, you can click Done Highlighting. Now you'll see when you scroll through the intent phrases that there are hard brackets around the cities that you've highlighted and also a parentheses afterwards, indicating that the item in the hard brackets is a city. If you made a mistake when highlighting earlier, you can edit your intent phrases directly like this. Just make sure that the entity that you're trying to highlight is in hard brackets, immediately followed by the entity name in parentheses with no space between the hard brackets and the parentheses. Additionally, if you don't even want to highlight at all, you could directly enter in your intent phrases with this specific syntax. Like we stated in part 1 of the tutorial, it's always better to have more intent phrases because that allows Convo to learn more information. The same goes for entities, so it's always better to have more entities of different types to allow Convo to learn more about what is a city and what is not. Now that we're done adding the intent, we have to retrain everything, so let's go ahead and click Train again. Again, like last time, we might have to wait a few minutes to train. I'm going to speed up the tutorial, and once you see the word done, we can move on to the programming portion of Convo. Just like we did for the intents hello and goodbye, we are also going to create a procedure that will run when the intent say the weather is recognized. Now last time, we used the command create a procedure to create a new procedure. But something that we can actually do as a little shortcut is directly connect our intent, say the weather, to the procedure weather forecast. With this command, Convo is smart enough to know to first create a new procedure weather forecast, and since we had an entity or a variable that we want to use in our procedure, Convo will go ahead and also create that step for you in the procedure. Note that since the user is typically going to pass in a value for the entity, as in they will tell you which city they want to know the weather of, we will set the initial value of this variable to 0. This value will be overwritten if the user provides the value for that entity, basically a city, when they talk to Convo. So now from here, we're simply going to edit the procedure that was made by Convo and add in a couple of steps. First, we're going to create a variable called temperature, and temperature will hold the value of the predicted weather temperature for the city that we care about. We'll set the initial value of temperature to 0, and this will also be the temperature value for any city that we don't recognize. Next, we'll create a few conditional statements. So we'll say, if the city is Boston, we will set the temperature to 30 degrees. And then we'll simply close this conditional statement. We'll do the same thing for the city Los Angeles, except this time we'll set the variable temperature to a much warmer 70. And we'll also close this conditional statement. Finally, we'll ask Convo to tell us what value the variable temperature is at the very end of the procedure. And that wraps up our procedure. We can then move on to the Talk to Convo page. On the Talk to Convo page, we'll see Convo recognizing the intent say the weather in real time. Because I want to ensure the accuracy of what I am saying, I will be typing instead of talking, unlike part 1 of the tutorial. First, I'm going to ask Convo, what's the weather in Los Angeles? And Convo returns the value of 70, which is the correct answer. From this, we can tell that Convo was able to correctly identify that Los Angeles was a city, and then compared that to the value that we had in our procedure, weather forecast. Let's try saying something else. So next, I'll say, tell me the weather in Boston. And Convo returns a value of 30, which is also correct. Again, this means that Convo was able to tell that Boston was the city that we cared about, and then was able to compare that value to our conditional statement in our procedure. Next, let's ask about New York. And here we see that Convo returns a value of 0, which is actually correct. Because when the city is not Boston or Los Angeles, we don't reset the temperature value, and so we will return the default temperature value of 0. Finally, let's include a city that we didn't include in our training data. So we'll ask, what is the weather in Honolulu? And we see that the value of the temperature is 0. This again is correct behavior because Honolulu is not Boston or Los Angeles, so we would return the default value of the temperature. This brings us to the end of part 2 of the Convo tutorial. We hope you found these tutorials helpful and can't wait to see what you build with Convo.